Chapter 11. When he came awake again, Pa Omsford found himself in the middle of a nightmare. He was bound hand and foot and hanging from a pole. He was being carried through a forest thick with mist and shadows, the dark crease of a deep ravine visible to his left, the jagged edge of a ridgeline sharp against the night sky to his right. Shrub and the dense tangle of grasses and weeds slapped at his back and head as he swung helplessly from the pole, and the air was thick, humid, and still. There were spider gnomes all around him, creeping soundlessly through the half-light on crooked legs. Pa closed his eyes momentarily to shut out the images, then opened them again. The skies were dark and overcast, but a scattering of stars shone through creases in the clouds, and there was a faint hint of brightness beyond the drop of the ravine. Night had come and gone, he realized. It was almost morning. He remembered then what had happened to him, how the spider gnomes had chased him, seized him, and taken him away. Cole. What had happened to Cole? He craned his neck in an effort to see if his brother had been brought as well, but there was no sign of him. He clenched his jaw in rage, remembering Cole falling, then sprawled on the ground with blood on his face. He wiped the image quickly from his mind. It was useless to dwell on it. He must find a way to get free and return for his brother. He worked momentarily against the ropes that bound him, testing their strength, but there was no give. Hanging as he was, he could not find the leverage necessary to loosen them. He would have to wait. He wondered then where he was being taken, why he had been taken in the first place, for that matter. What did the spider gnomes want of him? Insects buzzed in his face, flying at his eyes and mouth. He buried his face into his arms and left it there. When he brought it out again, he tried to determine where he was. The light was to his left, the beginnings of a new day. East, then, he decided. The spider gnomes were travelling north. That made sense. The spider gnomes had made their home on Toffer Ridge in Bryn Omsford's time. That was probably where he was. He swallowed against the dryness in his mouth and throat. Thirst and fear, he thought. He tried to recall what he could of spider gnomes from the stories of the old days, but he was unable to focus his thoughts. Bryn had encountered them when she, Roan Lee, Cogline, Kimberbow, and the moorcat Whisper had gone after the missing sword of Lee. There was something else, something about a wasteland and the terrifying creatures that lived within it. Then he remembered. Werebeasts. The name whispered in his mind like a curse. The spider gnomes turned down a narrow defile, filling it with their hairy forms like a dark stain, chittering now in what appeared to be an anticipation. The brightness in the east disappeared, and shadows and mist closed about them like a wall. His wrists and ankles ached, and his body felt stretched beyond help. The gnomes were small and carried him close to the ground, so that he bumped and scraped himself at every turn. He watched from his upside-down position as the defile broadened into a shelf that opened out over a vast, mist-shrouded stretch of emptiness that seemed to run on forever. The shelf became a corridor through a series of boulders that dotted the side of Toffer Ridge like knots on the back of a boar. Firelight flickered in the distance, pinpricks of brightness playing hide-and-seek among the rocks. A handful of spider gnomes bounded ahead, skittering effortlessly over the rocks. Pa took a deep breath. Wherever it was they were going, they were almost there. A moment later, they emerged from the rocks and came to a halt on a low bluff that ran back to a series of burrows and caves, tunnelled into the side of the ridge. Fires burned all about, and hundreds of spider gnomes shoved into view. Pa was dumped unceremoniously. the bonds that secured him cut and the pole removed. He lay there on his back for a moment, rubbing his wrists and ankles, finding creases so deep that he bled, conscious all the time of the eyes watching him. Then he was hauled to his feet and dragged toward the caves and burrows. They bypassed the latter in favour of the former, the gnarled hands of the gnomes fastening on him at every conceivable point, the stink of their bodies filling his nostrils. They chattered at each other in their own language, their talk incessant, now and meaningless to him. He did not resist. He could barely stand upright. They took him through the largest of the cave openings, propelled him past a small fire that burned at its mouth and stopped. There was some discussion, a few moments, worth at best, and then he was thrust forward. They saw they were in a smallish cave that ran back only 20 yards or so and was no more than 8 feet at its highest point. A pair of iron rings had been hammered into the rock wall at the cave's deepest point, and the spider gnomes lashed them to those. Then they left them, all but 2 who remained behind to take up the watch by the fire at the cave entrance. Pa let his mind clear, listening to the silence, waiting to see what would happen next. When nothing did, he took a careful look about. He had been left spread eagle against the rock wall, one arm secured to each of the iron rings. He was forced to remain standing because the rings were fastened too high up on the rock to allow him to sit. He tested his bonds. They were leather and secured so tightly that his wrists could not slip within them even the smallest amount. He sagged back momentarily in despair, forcing down the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. The others would be looking for him by now. Morgan, Steph, Teal. They would already have found Cole. They would track the spider gnomes and come for him. They would find him and rescue him. He shook his head. He was just kidding himself. He knew it. It was almost dark when the gnomes had taken him and the rain had been a hard one. There would have been no time for a search and no real chance of finding a trail. The best he could have hoped for was that Cole had been found or revived himself and gone to the others to tell them what had happened. He swallowed against the dryness. He was so thirsty. Time slipped away, 20 seconds to minutes, minutes, hours. The darkness outside brightened minimally, bringing a barely penetrable daylight, choked with the heat and mist. The faint sounds of the spider gnomes disappeared altogether, and he would have thought them gone completely, if not for the 2 who sat hunkered down by the cave's entrance. The fire went out, smoking for a time, then turning to ash. The day slipped away. Once, one of the guards rose and brought him a cup of water. He drank it greedily from the hands that held it up to his mouth, spilling most of it, soaking his shirt front. He grew hungry as well, but no food was offered. When the day began to fade to darkness again, the guards rebuilt the fire at the mouth of the cave, then disappeared. Pa waited expectantly, forgetting for the first time the ache of his body, the hunger and the fear. Something was going to happen now. He could feel it. What happened was altogether unexpected. He was working again in his bonds, his sweat loosening them now, mingling with the traces of his blood from the cuts that the ties had made, when a figure appeared from the shadows. It came past the fire and into the light and stopped. It was a child. Pa blinked. The child was a girl, perhaps a dozen years of age, rather tall and skinny with dark, lank hair and deep-set eyes. She was not a gnome, but of the race of man, a Southlander, with a tattered dress, worn boots, and a small silver locket about her neck. She looked at him curiously, studied him as if she might a stray dog or cat, then came slowly forward. She stopped when she reached him, then lifted one hand to brush back his hair and touch his ear. "Elf," she said quietly, fingering the ear's tip. Pa stared. What was a child doing out here among the spider gnomes? He wet his lips. Untie me, he begged. She looked at him. Some more, saying nothing. Untie me, Pa said again, more insistent this time. He waited, but the child just looked at him. He felt the beginnings of doubt creep through him. Something was not right. Hug you? The child said suddenly. She came to him almost anxiously, wrapping her arms about him, fastening herself to him like a leech. She clung to him, burying herself in his body, murmuring over and over again something he could not understand. What was the matter with this child? He wondered in dismay. She seemed lost, frightened perhaps, needing to hold him as much as he. The thought died away as he felt her stirring against him, moving within her clothes, against his clothes, then against his skin. Her fingers had tightened into him, and he could feel her pressing. Shock flooded through him. She was right against him, against his skin, as if they wore no clothes at all, as if all their garments had been shed. She was burrowing, coming against him, then coming into him, merging somehow with him, making herself a part of him. Shades! What was happening? Repulsion filled him with a suddenness that was terrifying. He screamed, shook himself in horror, kicked out desperately at last, flung her away. She fell in a crouch, her child face transformed into something hideous, smiling like a beast at feeding, eyes sharp and glinting with pinpricks of red light. Give me the magic, boy, she rasped in a voice that sounded nothing of a child's. Then he knew. Oh no, he whispered over and over, bracing himself as she came slowly back to her feet. This child was a shadow. Give it to me, she repeated, her voice demanding. Let me come into you and taste it. She came toward him, a spindly little thing, a bit of nothing if her face had not betrayed her. She reached for him, and he kicked out at her desperately. She smiled wickedly and stepped back. You are mine, she said softly. The gnomes have given you to me. I will have your magic, boy. Give yourself to me. See what I can feel like. She came at him like a cat at its prey, avoiding his kick, fastening herself to him with a howl. He could feel her moving almost immediately, not the child herself, but something within the child. He forced himself to look down and could see the faintest whisper of a dark outline shimmering within the child's body, trying to move into his own. He could feel its presence, like a chill on a summer's day, like flies' feet against his skin. The shadowing was touching, seeking. He drew back his head, clenched his jaw, made his body as rigid as iron, and fought it. The thing, the shadowing, was trying to come into him. It was trying to merge with him. Oh, shades! He must not let it. He must not. Then unexpectedly he cried out, releasing the magic of the wish song in a howl of mingled rage and anguish. It took no form, for he had already determined that even his most frightening images were of no use against these creatures. It came of its own volition, breaking free from some dark corner of his being to take on a shape he did not recognize. It was a dark, unidentifiable thing, and it whipped about him like whipping from a spider about its prey. The shadow hissed and tore itself away, spitting and clawing at the air. It dropped again into a crouch. The child's body contorted, shivering from something unseen. Pa's cry died into silence at the sight of it, and he sagged back weakly against the cave wall. "Stay back from me," he warned, gasping for breath. "Don't touch me again." He didn't know what he had done or how he had done it, but the shadow hunched down against the firelight and glared at him in defeat. The hint of being the being within the child's body shimmered briefly and was gone. The glint of red eyes disappeared. The child rose slowly and straightened. A child in truth once more, frail and lost. Dark eyes studied him for long moments, and she said faintly once more, "Hug me." Then she called into the gathering darkness without, and the spider gnomes reappeared, several dozen strong, bowing and scraping to the child as they entered. She spoke to them in their own language while they knelt before her, and Pa remembered how superstitious these creatures were, believing in gods and spirits of all sorts, and now they were in the thrall of a shadow, and he wanted to scream. The spider gnomes came for him, loosened the bonds that secured him, seized his arms and legs, and pulled him forward. The child blocked their way. "Hug me?" She looked almost forlorn. He shook his head, trying to break free of the dozens of hands that held him. He was dragged outside in the twilight haze, where the smoke of the fires and the mist of the lowlands mingled and swirled like dreams in sleep. He was stopped at the bluff's edge, staring down into a pit of emptiness. The child was beside him, her voice soft and sinuous. "Odin Moore," she whispered. "Werebeasts live there. Do you know Werebeasts, elf boy?" He stiffened. "They shall have you now, if you do not hug me. Feed on you despite your magic." He broke free then, flinging his captors from him. The shadow hissed and shrank away, and the spider gnomes scattered. He lunged, trying to break through, but they blocked his way and bore him back. He wheeled, buffeted first this way, then that. Hands reached for him, gnarled and hairy and grasping. He lost himself in a whirl of coarse bodies and chittering voices, hearing only his own voice screaming from somewhere inside, not to be taken again, not to be held. He was suddenly at the edge of the bluff. He summoned the magic of the wish song, striking out with images of spider gnomes who beset him, desperately trying to force a path through their mist. The shadow one had disappeared, lost somewhere in the smoke and shadows. Then he felt his feet go out from under him, the edge of the bluff giving aid beneath the weight of his attackers. He grappled for them, for a handhold anywhere, and found nothing. He toppled clear of the bluff, falling into the abyss, tumbling into the swirl of mist. The shadowwood, the spider gnomes, the fires, caves, and burrows, all disappeared behind him. Down he fell, head over heels, tumbling through shrub and brush and grasses, across slides and between boulders. Miraculously, he missed the rocks that might have killed or crippled him, falling clear finally in a long, agonizing drop that ended in jarring darkness. He was unconscious for a time. He didn't know how long. When he came awake again, he found himself in a crushed bed of damp marsh grasses. The grasses, he realized, must have broken his fall and probably saved his life. He lay there, the breath knocked from his body, listening to the sound of his heart pumping in his breast. When his strength returned and his vision cleared, he climbed gingerly to his feet and checked himself. His entire body was a mass of cuts and bruises, but there appeared to be nothing broken. He stood without moving then and listened. From somewhere far above, he could hear the voices of the spider gnomes. They would be coming for him, he knew. He had to get out of there. He looked about. Mist and shadows chased each other through a twilight world of gathering darkness. Night descending quickly now. Small, almost invisible things skipped and jumped through the tall grasses. Ooze sucked and bubbled all about. Hidden quagmires surrounding islands of solid earth. Stunted trees and brush defined the landscape. Frozen and grotesque poses. Sounds were distant and directionless. Everything seemed and looked the same. A maze without end. Pa took a deep breath to steady himself. He could guess where he was. He had been on top of a ridge. His fall had taken him down off the ridge and right into Olden Moor. In his efforts to escape his fate, he had only managed to find it sooner. He had put himself exactly where the Shadow One had threatened to send him, into the domain of the Werebeasts. He set his jaw and started moving. He was only at the edge of the moor, he told himself, not fully into it yet, not lost. He still had the ridge behind him to serve as a guide. If he could follow it far enough south, he could escape, but he had to be quick. He could almost feel the werebeast watching him. The stories of the werebeast came back to him now, jarred free by the realization of where he was and sharpened by his fear. They were an old magic, monsters who preyed off strayed and lost creatures who wandered into the moor or were sent there, dealing away their strength and spirit and feeding on their lives. The spider gnomes were their principal food. The spider gnomes believed the werebeasts were spirits that required appeasement, and they sacrificed themselves accordingly. Pa went cold at the thought. That was what the Shadow One had intended for him. Fatigue slowed him and made him unsteady. He stumbled several times, and once he stepped hip deep into a quagmire before quickly pulling free. His vision was blurred, and sweat ran down his back. The moor's heat was stultifying, even at night. He glanced skyward and realized that at the last of the light was fading. Soon it would be completely dark. Then he would not be able to see at all. A massive pool of sludge barred his way, the wall of the ridge eaten away so that it was impossible to climb past. His only choice was to go around, deeper into the moor. He moved quickly, following the line of the swamp, listening for the sounds of pursuit. There were none. The moor was still and empty. He swung back toward the bluff, encountered a maze of gullies with masses of things moving through them, and swung wide again. Steadily he went on, exhausted, but unable to rest. The darkness deepened. He found the end of the maze and started back again toward the bluff. He walked a long way, circling quagmires and sinkholes, peering expectantly through the gloom. He could not find Toffer Ridge. He walked more quickly now, anxious, fighting down the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He was lost, he realized, but he refused to accept it. He kept searching, unable to believe that he could have mistaken his direction so completely. The base of the ridge had been right there. How could he have become so turned about? At last he stopped, unable to continue with the charade. There was no point in going on, because the truth of the matter was he had no idea where he was going. He would simply continue to wander about endlessly until either the swamp or the werebeasts claimed him. It was better that he stand and fight. It was an odd decision, one brought about less by sound reasoning than fatigue. After all, what hope was there for him if he didn't escape the moor, and how could he escape the moor if he stopped moving? But he was tired, and he didn't like the idea of running about blindly, and he kept thinking of that child, that Shadow One, shrinking from him, driven back by some shading of the magic that hadn't that he hadn't even known existed. He still didn't understand what it was, but if he could somehow summon it again and master it in even the smallest way, then he had a chance against the Werebeasts and anything else the swamp might send against them. He glanced about momentarily, then walked to a broad hillock with quagmire on two sides, jutting rocks on a third, and only one way in, only one way out as well. He reminded himself as he ascended the rise, but then he wasn't going anywhere, was he? He found a flat rock and seated himself facing out into the mist and night until it grew light again. This was where he would make his stand. The minutes slipped away, night descended, the mist thickened, but there was still light, a sort of curious phosphorescence given off by the sparse vegetation. Its glow was faint and deceptive, but it gave Pa the means to distinguish what lay about him, the belief that he could catch something sneaking up on him. Nevertheless, he didn't see the shadow until it was almost on top of him. It was the child again, tall, thin, wasted. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, no more than a few yards in front of him, and he started with the suddenness of her coming. "Get back from me," he warned her, coming quickly to his feet. "If you try to touch me—" The shadow shimmered into the mist and disappeared. Pa took a deep breath. It hadn't been a shadow after all, he thought, but a werebeast, and not so tough if he could send it packing with just a threat. He wanted to laugh. He was near exhaustion, both physically and emotionally, and he knew he was no longer entirely rational. He hadn't chased anything away. That werebeast had simply come in for a look. They were toying with him, the way they did with their prey, taking on familiar forms, waiting for the right opportunity, till fatigue or fright or foolishness to give them an opening. He thought again about the stories, about the inevitability of the stalking, then pushed it all from his mind. Somewhere in the distance, far from where he sat, something cried out once, a quick shriek of dismay. Then everything was still again. He stared into the mist, watching. He found himself thinking of the circumstances that had brought him here, of his flight from the Federation, of his dreams, his meeting with the old man, and his search for Walker Bow. He had come a long way because of those circumstances, and he still wasn't anywhere. He felt a pang of disappointment that he hadn't accomplished more, that he hadn't learned anything useful. He thought again of his conversation with Walker. Walker had told him the Wish Song's magic was not a gift, despite his insistence that it was, and that there wasn't anything worthwhile to discover about its use. He shook his head. Well, perhaps there wasn't. Perhaps he had just been kidding himself all along. But something about it had frightened that shadow and something, yet only that child, not any of the others that he had encountered. What had been the difference? There was movement again at the edge of the mist, and a figure detached itself and moved toward him. It was the second shadow, the great, shambling creature they had encountered at the edge of their narn. It slouched toward him, grunting, carrying a monstrous club. For a moment he forgot what he was facing. He panicked, remembering the wish song had been ineffective against the shadow and that he had been helpless. He started to back away, then caught himself, thrust away his confusion and shook clear his mind. Impulsively, he used the wish song. Its magic, creating an identical image of the creature facing him, an image that he used to cloak himself. Shadowing faced shadowing. Then the werebeast shimmered and faded back into the mist. Pa went still and let the image concealing him dissolve. He sat down again. How long could he keep this up? He wondered if Cole was all right. He saw his brother stretched upon the earth, bleeding, and he remembered how helpless he had felt at that moment. He thought about how much he depended on his brother Cole. His mind wandered, shifted. There was a use for his magic, he told himself sternly. It was not as Walker had said. There was purpose in his having it. It was indeed a gift. He would find the answers at the Hatron. He would find them when he spoke to Al-Anon. He must simply get free of this more, and a gathering of shadowy forms emerged from the mist before him, dark and forbidding bits of ethereal motion in the night. The Werebeasts had decided to wait no longer. He jerked to his feet, facing them. They eased gradually, closer. First one, then another. None with any discernible shape, all shifting and changing as rapidly as the mist. Then he saw Cole, pulled from the darkness behind the shadow, gripped in substanceless hands, his face ashen and bloodied. Pa went cold. "Help me," he heard his brother call out, though the sound of the voice was only in his mind. "Help me, Pa." Pa screamed something with the magic of the West song, but it dissipated into the dank air of old and more. In a scattering of broken sounds, Pa shook as if chilled. Shades! That really was Cole. His brother struggled, fighting to break free, calling out repeatedly, "Pa! Pa!" He went to his brother's aid almost without thinking. He attacked the werebeast with a fury that was entirely unexpected. He cried out, the wish song's magic thrusting at the creatures, hammering them back. He reached Cole and seized him, pulling him free. Hands groped for him, touching. He felt pain, freezing and burning both at once. Cole gripped him and the pain intensified. Poison flooded into him, bitter and harsh. His strength almost gave out. But he managed to keep his feet, hauling his brother clear of the shadows, pulling him onto the rise. Below, the shadows clustered and shifted watchfully. Pa howled down at them, knowing he was infected, feeling the poison work its way through his body. Cole stood next to him, not speaking. Pa's thoughts scattered, and his sense of what he was about drifted away. The werebeasts began to close. Then there was fresh movement on the rocks to his right, and something huge appeared. Pa tried to move away, but the effort brought him to his knees. Great, luminous, yellow eyes blanked in the night, and a massive black shadow bounded to his side. "Rumour," he whispered in disbelief. The moor cat edged carefully past him to face Cole. The huge cat growled, a low, dangerous warning cough that seemed to break through the mist and fill the darkness with shards of sound. "Cole?" Pa called out to his brother and started forward, but the moor cat quickly blocked his way, shoving him back. The shadows were moving closer, taking form now, becoming lumbering things, bodies covered with scales and hair, faces that showed demon eyes and jaws split wide in hunger. Rimmer spat at them and lunged, bringing them up short to hiss back at him. Then he whirled with claws and teeth, bared and tore Cole to pieces. Cole, what had appeared to be Cole, turned into a thing of indescribable horror, bloodied and shredded, then shimmered and disappeared. Another deception. Pa cried out in anguish and fury. Tricked, ignoring the pain and the sudden nausea, he sent the magic of the world's wish song hurtling at the werebeasts. Daggers and arrows of fury, images of things that could rend and tear. The werebeasts shimmered and the magic passed harmlessly by. Reforming the werebeasts' attack, Rumour caught the closest a dozen paces off, hammering it away with a single breathtaking swipe of one great paw. Another lunge, but the cat caught it as well and sent it spinning. Others were appearing now from the shadows and mist behind those already creeping forward. Too many, thought Pa. Frantically, he was too weak to stand. The poison from the Werebeasts' touch seeping through him rapidly now, threatening to drop him into that familiar black abyss that had begun to open within. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder, firm and instantly comforting, reassuring him and at the same time holding him in place, and he heard a voice call sharply, "Ruma!" The moorcat edged back, never turning to look, responding to the sound of the voice alone. Pa lifted his face. Walkabow was beside him, wrapped in black robes and mist, his narrow chiseled face set in a look that turned Pa cold, his skin so white it might have been drawn in chalk. "Keep still, Pa," he said. He moved forward to face the werebeasts. There were more than a dozen now, crouched down at the edge of the rise, drifting in and out of the mist and night. They hesitated at Walkabow's approach, almost if they knew him. Pa's uncle came directly down to them, stopping when he was less than a dozen yards from them. "Leave," he said simply and pointed off into the night. The werebeasts held their ground. Walker came forward another step, and this time his voice was hard, and it seemed to shiver the air. "Leave!" One of them lunged at him, a monstrous thing, jaws snapping as it reached for the black-robed figure. Walkabow's hand shot out, dust scattering into the beast. Fire erupted into the night with an explosion that rocked the bottomland, and the werebeast simply disappeared. Walker's extended hand swept the circle of those that remained, threatening. An instant later, the werebeasts had faded back into the night and were gone. Walker turned and came back up the rise, nearly next to Pa. "This is my fault," he said quietly. Pa struggled to speak and felt his strength give out. He was sick. Consciousness slipped away. For the third time in less than 2 days, he tumbled into the abyss. He remembered thinking as he fell that this time he was not sure he would be able to climb out again.